We are on the bottom of 69a. 3. Okay, so the last thing we saw was Eliezer was telling us that even though he holds that you're allowed to do preliminary things to the Karban Pesach, like carry the animal even without an Eruv, or you could take the animal from beyond the Tchum, and you could travel beyond the Tchum, or you could take off awards, all those things are allowed to be done for the Karban Pesach, but sprinkling in order to get the person purified, that cannot be done. That cannot be done. And the reason, he said, the last reason we established was because we said, Gavra lo chazi. Since the person is, whereas when it comes to Karban Pesach, the person's obligated to bring the Karban Pesach, okay? So therefore I'm allowed to do whatever I need to do to bring the Karban Pesach. I have an obligation to the Karban Pesach. My animal, I happen to be past the Tchum. Okay, so walk beyond the Tchum. My animal happens to have a wart. I'll pop the wart. All those things, but I have an obligation to it. When it comes to a person who's tamei, the reason we don't do the sprinkling is because as long as the person's tamei, they don't have an obligation because they're tamei. That was the basic distinction that Rebbe Eliezer made. However, we're going to challenge this. Abaye says, wait a second. You told me that when you don't have, when you're not able to do something, meaning the person is tamei, can't bring the karban, therefore he has no obligation to bring the karban, right? And that's why you don't get sprinkled. He says we have an example of someone who is unable to do something, yet we see he does have an obligation. What's that? An uncircumcised person who doesn't, who basically someone who doesn't have a bris milah, and they don't circumcise themselves in time to bring the Karban Pesach, they're punished with kares. Div Rebbe Eliezer. We see these words. This is Rebbe Eliezer speaking, the same Rebbe Eliezer. So v'hahacha degaver gufalo chazi. It's the same exact scenario. The person right now, as long as they don't have a bris, they are not fit to bring the Karban Pesach. Uktani anish kares. And yet we see they do have an obligation to bring it, right? On the one hand, the person's not fit. At the same time, the fact that the punishment is kares tells us that they're obligated to bring it. So what do you see? You see someone who is unfit right now still has an obligation. So based on your logic, right, Rebbe Eliezer, how could you say, I don't have to sprinkle, I don't do the sprinkling on Shabbos, which falls on Erev Pesach, because the person's not fit, and therefore they don't have an obligation. But you see by someone who's uncircumcised, even though they're not fit, they do have an obligation. That's why the punishment is kares. So Alma Rami Chiyuv, we see that the person does have an obligation. So Amar Rabba gives a bit of a long answer. We're going to try to simplify it as best as possible. He says like this. Amar Rabba gives the following answer. Basically, his answer is pointing out that the general way of saying it is that someone who's uncircumcised is different than someone who is tamei, and he's going to explain why. So Kesavar Eliezer and Shochtim Zorkan Al Sheretz. So number one, there's a couple of statements and principles that are going to be relevant to this answer. Number one is that Eliezer holds that a person who is tamei by a sheretz is not someone who we would bring the Karban Pesach for on Erev Pesach. Meaning, if let's say, forget Shabbos for a second. Let's say Erev Pesach was on a Tuesday. Pesach's on Tuesday night. And the person touched a sheretz that day. Now, normally a person touches a sheretz, they become tahar that night. We still do not sprinkle the blood for the person, even though by that night they would be tahar, but since during Erev Pesach they're tamei, we don't sprinkle blood. We don't bring the Karban Pesach for them, even though by that night they'd be able to eat it. But since in that moment they're unable to eat it because they're still tamei, we wouldn't sprinkle blood for them. By saying it's tamei sheretz, it's not limited to someone who's tamei sheretz. Anyone who is their tumah is going to finish that night, right? Tamei sheretz is just a good example of that because it's someone who only has a 1 day tumah. But let's say you have someone who became tamei 7 days earlier, and that's their 7th day. Same thing. Okay, 69b1. That's point number one. Any situation where an individual would have been deferred to Pesach Sheni, B'tzibur Avdei B'tumah. That same exact situation would be one which the congregation would bring their karban in a state of tumah. Right? Those two always go hand in hand. An individual has to wait till Pesach Sheni, but a congregation will never wait for Pesach Sheni. Or a congregation will not wait for Pesach Sheni. So therefore, any situation where the individual will be deferred to Pesach Sheni, in the same exact situation, the congregation has that same exact impediment, they would not wait, they would do it right then. Okay, that's point number two. And anything which is true, any obligation which is there for the congregation, the Karban Pesach is going to be an obligation for the individual as well. And anything which is not an obligation for the congregation, you have a situation where the congregation may not be obligated to do so, there's not going to be an obligation on the individual as well. Okay? Those are the three different principles. And now let's start plugging this in. Arelos, when it comes to being uncircumcised, dikulet tzibur arelim ninu. Let's say you have a situation where the entire congregation is uncircumcised. Okay? So amrinalu, what would we say to them? Kumu mohalu nafshaychu v'avidu pischa. Everyone go and get circumcised in order to bring the Karban Pesach. Yachinami arinale. Therefore, we say to an individual who, and let's say you have a situation where it's only an individual. So we've established that the tzibur and yachid, there's always going to be, the obligation is always going to be the same. Whatever obligation there is for the congregation, there's going to be obligation for the individual. And we've just said that if the entire congregation is not circumcised, we would tell them all, go get circumcised. So too, yachid, in a situation where there's just an individual who is uncircumcised, we would tell the person that they have to go ahead and get circumcised. Since in the same situation, if the congregation was not circumcised, we would tell you to do so. So too, if you're just an individual, we would tell you to do so. Vilo mahil va'avid, and let's the person does not circumcise, and they go ahead and they bring the offering without being circumcised, anush kares. The punishment would be kares, because since the congregation has an obligation, so too you, the individual, have an obligation. So tuma, let's contrast that with tuma. Let's say you have the whole congregation which are contaminated, we would not sprinkle upon them, okay? Because why? Because number one, as we established, Eliezer holds that even though a person becomes tahar that night, that is not enough of a reason to bring the Karban Pesach for that individual. So bottom line is, what would happen? We would say, if the congregation is entirely tameh, we would say, Ela avdi b'tumah. We would say, go ahead and make it in a state of tumah, right? If the congregation is all on their 7th day of tumah, let's say the whole congregation went to a funeral 7 days prior for the king, for the nasi, whatever it is. So the whole congregation is tameh on Erev Pesach. We would say, go ahead, bring go ahead and don't sprinkle, and bring the Karban Pesach. So if there's going to be this correlation between the public and the individual, yachinami pater. What would come out is we would say, if the whole congregation was tameh on this day, we would say don't sprinkle and just serve. And that means that if the individual is tameh, we'd also say don't sprinkle. But for the yachid, we'd say, okay, and therefore you have an obligation, you wait till Karban Pesach Sheni. So the bottom line is, you see that there's a massive difference between uncircumcised, where there would be the situation where the entire congregation would be obligated, and therefore the individual is obligated as well. Whereas when it comes to Tumah, we'd say the whole congregation would not be obligated, okay, because they would not be obligated. So too the yachid, so too the individual also wouldn't be obligated. And therefore, don't bring me a raya, don't bring me a proof and a question from the situation of someone who's uncircumcised, where you said, oh, look, if someone's uncircumcised, they do get kares for not getting circumcised. Why? So therefore, you see that a person who is not fit is obligated. And we said, whoa, that's different. There, since the congregation would be obligated, the individual is obligated. But by tumah, where the congregation is not obligated, then the individual will not be obligated as well. And therefore, you can't ask me a question from uncircumcised, which is radically different than the case of tumah. Okay, now the Gemara questions this on 2 counts. Okay, ultimately, Gemara is going to reject this whole line of thinking. Okay, so the first question is a simple back and forth, and that is that the premise was any obligation on the individual. There's going to be always a consistency between obligation on the congregation and the individual. Ask the Gemara, Amarle Rav Huna Breder Rav Yishua Rava Var Pesach Sheni Delesi B'Tzibur B'Yisur B'Yachid. Wait a second, what about Pesach Sheni? There's no greater example of something which there is no such thing as Pesach Sheni for the congregation. We never have Pesach Sheni for the whole congregation. You either all bring the Karban Pesach in a state of Tumah on the first one, or you're out. Meaning, if let's say you have a case where the whole congregation is a Zav, okay, they're all Zavin, okay, as bizarre as that may be, there would not be a Pesach Sheni and not be a Pesach Rishon. Okay, the bottom line is there's no Pesach Sheni for the congregation. Okay, so there's no such thing for the congregation, and yet it does exist for the Yachid. You told me they're always going to be hand in hand. Amalei Shani Hassam. He said, whoa, there's no comparison over there. Why? Da Avilei Tzibura Barishon. Since the congregation did a Pesach Rishon, therefore, that's what triggers the Pesach Sheni. In other words, yes, it's true they're brought on different dates, but the point is that the principle still stands that there's always going to be a correlation and a connection between the individual and the congregation. That only because the congregation had a Pesach Rishon, that's what triggers the Pesach Sheni. So the truth is they are still connected. It's true. The individual will always bring on a different date than the congregation. But again, the premise, the question was, hey, you're telling me that whatever exists for the congregation exists for the individual. Pesach Sheni only exists for the individual. We say, no. Pesach Sheni and Pesach Rishon always go hand in hand. For example, let's go back to that Zav case. If let's say there was no Pesach Rishon because everyone was Zavin, there would not be a Pesach Sheni that year. So there still is this correlation and twinning between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, even though it's true they fall on different dates, but they really are intrinsically connected, like we established earlier. Okay, 69b2. So I'm going to ask another question that we said that this is going to be the stronger question. The question ultimately unravels everything, and that is that Abaye said or assumed that a person has the last day of their tumah, either it's a sheretz tumah or it's the 7th day of their tumah. Then we said that there there is no obligation for the person to purify themselves. We said that's Rabbi Eliezer's position. However, we're going to show that's not Rabbi Eliezer's position. Okay, so you may have thought that a person, the only people who would get kares for not bringing their Karban Pesach is someone who is pure at the time of the sacrifice, or they are in Yerushalayim, they're not far away, they just choose not to do so. And that would be based on a simple read of the Psukim. The simple read of the Psukim imply that a person is tahar, they're able to bring the Karban, or they're nearby and they're able to bring the Karban. They don't, they get kares. You would think those are the only cases. However, you would say Arel, someone who is uncircumcised, Utmei Sheretz, or someone who is contaminated by a Sheretz, Ushar Kol Tmeim, or other types of tumas. Aminayin, how do you know that they also would get kares? Tamalomar Veha-ish. The pasuk says, and the man who is tar or who is not distant. The fact that it says and the man implies there are more people included, and that includes all these people, including someone who's contaminated by Sheretz, who would get kares for not bringing Karban Pesach. So says the Gemara, the fact that the Gemara looks for a separate source for kares for someone who has contaminated by sheretz, okay, so it clearly holds that we don't slaughter the Karban Pesach or throw its blood for someone who's contaminated by a sheretz. Why? Because if we would hold that a person who has a tuma sheretz, you would be able to throw his blood, in other words, you're able to bring the Karban Pesach, why would you need a separate source? It's the same case as tar. In other words, if you hold that a person who is on their seventh day of Tumah, i.e., someone who's, meaning similar to someone who's a Tzmei Sheretz, that you're able to bring a Karban for them on the seventh day, right? Then how do we treat that person? That person is ultimately a tahar person, because by that night they're going to be tahar. Clearly, the fact that the Gemara doesn't, what the Bryce is trying to find a proof to say that someone who is Tzmei Sheretz and doesn't bring a Karban Pesach gets kares. Now, what does this Tana hold about someone who's a Tzmei Sheretz? Does the Tana hold that such a person you're able to bring a Karban for them or not able to bring a Karban? Clearly, you're not able to bring a Karban, because if you were able to bring a Karban, then you would say, if you were able to bring a Karban, then that person is simply a tar person, because by that night they'd be tar. So clearly, this brisa holds like Rabbi Eliezer that says it's Tzmei Sheretz, you cannot bring the Karban for them on that day. That's point number one. Alma, so what comes out? Afagav Dol Chazi, so it's going like Rabbi Eliezer, and it's saying that even though this person is unfit to bring the Karban, because they're Tzmei Sheretz, and you're not able to, right, they can't bring the Karban for them, Chiyuv Ve'alei, still there's going to be an obligation on the person, V'afagav V'leis B'tzibor, and even though this is something which is not an obligation for the congregation, right, because if the congregation was Tameh, we would go ahead and just go ahead and bring the Karban. Isa B'yachid, it exists for an individual. So you see, Ela Amarava, fine. So the bottom line is you see that all those assumptions that we made earlier don't stand. Bottom line is you see someone who's a Tzmei Sheretz who is going to get kares for not bringing it. Didn't you, Rabbi Eliezer, tell me, or we assumed, Abaye's explanation of Rabbi Eliezer assumes that a person who's a Tzmei Sheretz will not get kares because there's no obligation yet. In other words, the whole premise of this whole discussion was that someone who is unfit can't have an obligation. But now we're saying someone who's a Tzmei Sheretz clearly does have an obligation because he gets kares if he doesn't bring it. So you see someone who's unfit does have such an obligation. So it says, Rava says a new explanation for Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer, Shochlim Zorgin al Tzmei Sheretz. So first of all, he holds that we do slaughter the Pesach offering and throw its blood for a person who's contaminated by a sheretz. And again, like we said earlier, this would apply to someone on the seventh day of their tumah. We would bring a karban. Okay, so far now he's telling us that really we misunderstood things. Really, according to Eliezer, you would bring the karban for such a person. So let's say their seventh day of tumah falls on Tuesday, you would bring the karban Pesach for such a person, even though they're tummy right now, since that night they'll be tahar. But now let's plug it into Shabbos. Now it's Shabbos, right? And so what's the challenge? Challenge is, are we allowed to sprinkle the person with blood, sprinkle the person with the ashes in order to make the person tahar that night? And Rabbi just says not. Why not? Because hazalamai, what is hazah? What does the sprinkling allow the person to do? Lachila just allows the person to eat it. Achilas Pesachim l'ma'akva, to eat the Karban Pesach, that is not essential. It's not essential to eat the Karban Pesach, and therefore, although the Gemara is going to question that in a moment, but which we'll get to based on if you were earlier Gemaras. But the bottom line is he's saying that so like this. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying the reason you can't do hazah, the reason you can't do the sprinkling to make the person tahar on Shabbos is because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, meaning anything that matters that you're allowed to do. But if it's something which doesn't matter, it's something which is going to be not going to help you for your obligation, you wouldn't be allowed to do. And therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says you're not allowed to sprinkle the ashes and make the person tahar on Shabbos, because doing so is not necessary. Because anyways, they can bring the karban for the person, even though they're in a state of tumah still. Okay, but sprinkling the ashes would only allow the person to eat it, and eating it is not necessary. Ask the Gemara 69b3. Nimsa Pesach nishchat shelo la'ochlav. That would come out that you're slaughtering the Pesach for people who are unable to eat it, and we've talked about it earlier. You can't do so. Amar Lei says no. You're making it. There's a distinction. Shelo la'ochlav lechol lechozi lochazi. The prohibition or that we're not allowed to do is only for someone who actually is unfit. They really can't eat. A sick person, an old person, they actually can't eat. Aval hai mechse chazi is fit. Takuni hu d'lo masakin. He's just unprepared. The Gemara is telling us the chiddush over here that this whole idea of slaughtering for people who can't eat was only someone who literally can't eat. But a person who can eat, they're tamei, you would be allowed to slaughter for them because they are fit to eat. They're able to eat. They're able to eat. They're just not fit to eat due to external factor of Tuma. And therefore the Gemara is saying that, again, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the reason you can't sprinkle the ashes is because really the Korban Pesach will be a valid Korban even though the person's Tameh. It's just that, they can't eat? Okay, fine. They won't be able to eat at this moment, but it doesn't prevent them from the Korban Pesach, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer would hold sprinkling is unnecessary for Shabbos to do the mitzvah, and therefore you don't do the sprinkling. Okay, Klalam Rabbi Kiva, the end of the Gemara was, the Mishnah was, Rabbi Kiva said that any malacha that could have been performed before Shabbos does not override Shabbos. Okay, the slaughtering, which could not be done before Shabbos, that does override Shabbos. Amar Rav Yehuda Rav, halacha Rabbi Kiva. Halacha is like Rabbi Kiva, not like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, even carrying the animal, even all that could have been, even though it could have been done before, I could still do it on Shabbos. Rabbi Kiva says, no. If I could have done it before, I have to have done it before. And Rabbi Yehuda Rav says, halacha is like Rabbi Kiva. Udanami gabe mila gavna. And we have the same dialogue when it comes to bris milah. Klalam Rabbi Kiva, there's a rule that we said, Rabbi Kiva, any malacha that could have been done before Shabbos, Eino dochas Shabbos does not override Shabbos. Mila she'ef shel Shabbos, circumcision that itself, which could not have been done before Shabbos, dochas Shabbos that override Shabbos. And again, we say the halachas Rabbi Kiva. Says the Gemara Tzricha. Why need both cases? Basically, they're arguing about the same thing two places. In both places, Rabbi Eliezer says even though it could have done before Shabbos, you're allowed to do it. Rabbi Kiva says no. If it couldn't have done before Shabbos, you can't do it. So why do you have to say in both cases halachas Rabbi Kiva? Diashmina gabe Pesach. Had you only said about Pesach, hasam hu machshirei mitzvah lo dachu Shabbos. There we'd say by Korban Pesach the preliminaries do not override Shabbos. Rabbi Kiva would hold mishum lo nichsru la shlosha asher brisos because it doesn't have 13 unique terms of bris regarding the Korban Pesach. About Mila, when it comes to circumcision, where the Torah says 13 covenants were made about it. In other words, it's seen bris Mila is very, very elevated. Maybe it's so important, even the preliminaries would override it. Okay, and therefore Rav has to tell us that no, even though not only by bris Mila, not only by Korban Pesach, but also by bris Mila, Yishmin Mila, had he only taught it by Mila, we'd say, there we hold like Rabbi Kiva, and we'd say the preliminaries don't override Shabbos like a karis, because not getting a bris Mila, you don't get karis for. Of a Pesach, the karis, but if you don't do the Korban Pesach, you would get karis. Maybe you'd say it's so important that even the preliminaries should override it. Trichi, therefore, because each one has its own, unique, stringency, and therefore it had Rabbi Yehuda Rav only said in one place Lachas Rabbi Kiva, you'd say maybe in the other place Lachas Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore you have to say in both cases, you have to say Lachas Rabbi Kiva teach you that in both cases, even though they're so important, the preliminaries would not override Shabbos, had just assuming it could have been done before Shabbos. Have a great day.